Today we are in week 2 of our series, Choose Joy. Last week we kind of kicked off this series with an idea of just kind of celebrating what this season is all about. And we talked a lot about hope and how hope is a precursor to joy because it's better than just a wish. It's something that we actually can believe to become true, and that belief kind of leads us to being able to be joyful. And today we're going to continue into this series about some of the elements that helps us actually choose joy. Usually when we actually say those two words, it feels like it's an imperative that is something that's like, okay, come on, if it was that easy, I would just do it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of these elements about how it can kind of help us make this decision to choose a joy. But in doing so, we were talking about the Christmas stories, and the Christmas story or the events of Christmas would be unbelievable if the story weren't so remarkable. There's an unbelievable nature to it, right? When you read the Christmas story or you hear the Christmas story, there are parts of it that's pretty hard to believe, right? Right? Like if you read the Christmas story and you're like, yeah, that girl got pregnant that way. That's that's unbelievable, right? I mean, there's different aspects to this. The wise men saw this star and they traveled months to find this thing. Like there's aspects to this thing that's so unbelievable, and it really would be unbelievable if it wasn't so remarkable. And here's the reason why is because the story of Christmas and the story of Jesus coming to earth started long before the events that we kind of read about in Matthew and in Luke. We see them all throughout the Old Testament. The story began with a man that God called. It began in Genesis with a promise that God made through one man that the entire world would be blessed, because apparently the world needed blessing. And the world needed Christmas, but as it turns out, God needed it as well. So he talks about this one man, Abraham, right? And he said, Abraham, you're not going to be around for it. In fact, not a lot of you will be, but it took 2,000 years. Parents, have you ever thought, if they only knew how I felt about them and had their best interest of heart, would they trust me? If my kids would only know, if they only knew how I felt about them, would they trust me? If they only could grasp the gravity of my love for them, would they actually listen to me and trust me? I think God, our Heavenly Father, felt the same way, and so he had to get the word out. But the question was how? How would he get the word out? How does God, our Heavenly Father, get the word out? How does God, the Spirit, communicate love and concern to a material world turned in on itself? And so God needed to stage a demonstration. God needed to be like, I need to show them how much I care, how much I love them. The world needed an illustration. We needed to see it to believe it. How many people fall into that category, right? It's, you want to see it first before you really believe it. And so God felt like this needs to happen. And then we actually live this way, right? It's easier to believe something once we see it. I think we all can agree on that. But there are things in faith and in belief and in trust that sometimes we believe without seeing because we believe because we know that person. We just kind of believe that to be the case. Well, God's like, man, he senses that the world needed a demonstration. They needed to see. So he thought, okay, this is what we got to do. We got to do it this way. And so we see this. Last week we talked about hope. Today we're going to talk about something else. And this is one of the most popular verses, if not the most popular verse in all of Christianity. In fact, if you know nothing about Christianity, know nothing about the Bible, you know this verse. And it's simply this: God so loved the world that he sent his only son, right? Whoever believes in him is not going to perish but have everlasting life. He didn't send his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Those are powerful, powerful words. But when you take it in the context of the demonstration that God needed to prove that he loved you, God sent his son into the world. He so loved the world that he sent his son. his one and only son. He wanted to create a demonstration. Paul, who was a Pharisee, who was a very zealot Jewish person, who martyred Christians, who approved of their killing before he actually became one, and then he became one of the most influential, impactful people on the planet, starting churches all throughout Europe and around the Mediterranean rim in his day. He had he had these specific messianic expectations. He believed that there was going to be a Messiah that was born, who was going to save those people, and he was raised to believe that. But he had an aha moment, and we kind of read about this in Galatians chapter 4, which is, we're going to spend some time jumping around from different places, probably places that you weren't expecting to go at a Christmas message. Today we're going to look at Galatians chapter 4, and it says this in Galatians chapter 4, beginning in verse 4. When the right time came, when the set time, another translation said, had fully come. When the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law, born under the woman, born under the law, an empire in its prime with its own great commission at the time, to Romanize the known world and civilize the known world, kind of leaving its wake a common culture, a common language, a common highway and port system, a common, a failed kind of temple, where money triumphed mercy, where corruption was there, where cleanliness trumped compassion, and God was valued, but those God valued weren't really that valued. That was kind of the instance of the day where it was the empire built on violence, and it was a temple that was sustained through corruption. And then what we see here, what Paul is saying is, when the right time came, and many of us would be like, that doesn't seem like quite the right time to do something. But God's timing is different, right? When the set time had fully come, when the right time came, God sent his son. Why? Why God in a body? Why not a messenger? As we saw last week, God's messengers were feared. Like every time an angel appears, people were scared out of their minds. And of course, the first message is, don't be afraid. I bring you, good news, great joy, and this is what's going to happen, and all these kind of things. Why did God send, why God in a body? Why not a messenger? God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, subject to the law. Why like this? Why show up like this as one of us, accountable to the law, instead of a law unto himself? And he goes on, it says that he was born of a woman, he was subject to the law. To do what? Why did God need to do this? He says, God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law. Another translation says, God sent him to redeem us, to pay for us, to purchase our salvation, to purchase our forgiveness. He sent him to us to buy freedom for us who were slaves, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. He did what laws and prophets and judges and warnings and exiles and punishments and all kinds of these other things, even sacred texts couldn't do, to do something so personal that would pave the way for something relational. He really was like, hey, in this context that all you know is this temple system where people have to come and talk to somebody to be, and hope and just trust that their sins are forgiven, and you have all these different things, these warnings and the things that the prophets are saying at the time. And what Paul is saying is, hey, this is what happened. This is the message of Jesus, that God sent Jesus, born of a woman, who was actually one of us, to buy our freedom so that he could adopt us as one of his own kids. That's why. So he did something very personal so that we could have a relationship with him. To redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption. To remove the obstacle to unrestricted fellowship with God. It was so personal, so he became a person. How would we know where we stood with God if God had come to stand with us? So just at the right time, God staged a demonstration. He wanted to show us what it meant right? Actions speak louder than words, even words on a page. How would somebody show you that they loved you? It's nice to be told that somebody loves you, right? It's even nicer if somebody shows you that they love you. And I think that's what God was doing at this moment. That's what Paul is making the argument about. It had to be a demonstration that would be documented. And in Romans, he actually says this. In Romans chapter 5, it says this, but God demonstrated his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. God demonstrated his love for us. This word demonstrates, this Greek word here, to provide evidence of a personal characteristic or claim through action, right? There's an action here to demonstrate, to show, to bring out, right? God demonstrates his own love for in this, and the prophets hinted at this. Sacred text foreshadowed this. In Jesus, God demonstrated and documented this. God showed us while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus' death was both a demonstration as much as it was of how much he was for us. Again, it's kind of different, right? We're talking about Christmas, but we're talking about the purpose that Jesus came to this earth to buy our freedom so that we could have personal relationship with God. And what Paul is arguing here is that God demonstrated his love for us by sending his son to buy our freedom, to die for us. It was a demonstration of how much he was for us. And this is the thing. He demonstrated he was for us before we even had an opportunity to decide if we were for him. He demonstrated that he was for us before you even had an opportunity to decide if you were for him. That's awesome to think about, because there may be some people in this room that are saying, hey, you know what? I'm not sure how I feel about this. I'm not sure if I completely believe all this. It seems kind of an unbelievable story, this Christmas story, and if everything's founded on this, I'm not really sure kind of where I stand. Guess what? It doesn't matter. God demonstrated that he loves you before you even decided if you were for him or not. It's so cool. It's so cool to understand that we have this choice. But here's the question. Why die? Why such a violent and public demonstration? Why couldn't Jesus just pronounce that everybody was forgiven? Right? Why can't he just say, you know what? Heads up, everybody. My dad says you're forgiven. You're good. Take that to the bank. Who would have believed him, right? Who could actually even say that? God is the author of life. He's the author of your life. And whether it's 6 literal days of creation or whether it's 4.5 billion years of supernatural selection or something in between, God is the author of life. And to dishonor the source of life is an expression of ingratitude, deserving the forfeiture of life. And so what God is doing is that we owe God our lives. As the author of life, we owe God our lives. We forfeited our right to life because of our disregard for life and for God. And so what God is saying here is, and what Paul is saying here is that, hey, he sent his son so that we could have new life, and we have a debt that we cannot repay. And so God had a plan. He had a demonstration. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Peter and Andrew and John and the followers of Jesus understood this. That when they stepped into Jerusalem to preach after Jesus' resurrection, they got it. And for a long time, they didn't get it. In fact, Jesus would talk to them oftentimes in ways that they didn't understand, and they would actually have to go back to him and question and be like, what were you talking about? And he would have to explain it, and it was still kind of muddy to them. But after Jesus' death and after his resurrection, all of a sudden, everything that Jesus taught became crystallized in their mind, like, that's why he said that. They got it. They understood what was going on. So then when they get up in the streets of Jerusalem after the resurrection in the book of Acts, Luke's writing this book to kind of prove that the account of Jesus is actually validated, is actually real. And so in the book of Acts, this is what it says. It says, Peter gets up there and says this, you disown the holy and righteous one and ask that a murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life. That's pretty bold. But God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this. There was a demonstration. Jesus' death demonstrated the magnitude of our ingratitude, and it demonstrated the magnitude of his love for us. Here's where it kind of gets tricky, because we fall into this trap a lot, right? Imagine somebody coming up and be like, you know what? You killed that guy. Like, I didn't kill that guy. I mean, I wasn't even in the crowd that day. What are you talking about? I killed that guy. You did this. Your inaction did this. Or the way that you didn't speak up did this. Like Peter was kind of saying, this. Now, they were there. But what's hard for us to understand is that we, thousands of years later, if I said, hey, you did that. It's like, no, I wasn't even there. Like, my parents weren't even alive back then. My grandparents weren't even alive back then. What do you mean I did this? That's where we have to be like, okay, God, what does this really mean? How's God demonstrating his love for us? How has God demonstrated his love for us? Jesus' death demonstrated the magnitude of his love for us, because you can't demonstrate love without a sacrifice. And you can't demonstrate a great love without a great sacrifice. You never know how much someone loves you until he or she has an opportunity to sacrifice for you. It's unbelievable. When somebody has an opportunity to sacrifice for you, that says a whole lot about how they feel for you. God demonstrated his great love for you through a great and necessary sacrifice. Because right before Paul says that God demonstrated his love for us, he says this. He says, very rarely, most people would not be willing to die for a good person. Most people wouldn't be willing to die for an upright person, though some might perhaps be willing to die for a person who's really good, who's especially good, who's really good. But God demonstrated his own love for us, that while we were no good, he died for us. In fact, some commentators would say it's not that we didn't bring anything to the table. It's not that we had anything to offer God. We actually had a deficit. We were a deficit to him. He was taking on something by demonstrating his love for us. God showed us through sending his son. He demonstrated to us and documented his love for us, for this race of people who hadn't decided if they were for him yet or not. Otherwise, how would we have ever known? Jesus had come our way and died our kind of death to lay the groundwork for a relationship of trust with the Father. And we point to this. Christianity points to this. We highlight the gap between us, the chasm between us, the mystery, and then Jesus. That chasm is crossed, and the mystery is solved. So when the time had fully come, when the right time came, a Jewish carpenter discovers that his fiancée is pregnant, and when he's trying to decide what to do right then, God sends him a messenger. Right? Just think about that. Jewish carpenter, his fiancée is pregnant, not by him. He's trying to figure out what to do. God sends him a messenger. It says this. It says, after he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph, son of David, in a dream. And he said, Joseph, son of David, the angel said, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit. Which I can imagine as Joseph was sitting there going, okay, that answers question number one I had. And she's going to have a son, the angel says. And you're to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. He will save his people from their sins. And all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Just think about that. This is hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 years later, that all this was to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet Isaiah. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. I mean, we sang that this morning, but it's like this idea that God is with us, that there was a demonstration for God to prove that he loved you. And the demonstration was, I'm going to be here. I'm going to send my son to be one of you to let you know that I love you and I care for you and I'm with you and I'm for you. He staged a demonstration and documented it so that the world would know. We needed to see it to believe it. We needed to see it to trust it. He had to be with us so we could know that he was for us. That's the demonstration. That's the demonstration. He had to be with us so that we could know that he was for us. And we needed that demonstration to know that he loved us. So for God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. He didn't send his son into this world to condemn the world, but to free the world, right? To let the world, to give the world freedom. And this is what I love in this verse. If we go on in this verse, it says, in this passage in John 3, we know 3:16, 3:17, 3:18 says this: there's no judgment against anyone who believes in him. But anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And here's where I want to land today. And the judgment is based on this fact: God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light. That's the decision that you have to make. And this is something that was written down a long time ago, but I think it still rings true today. That is why we're saying, hey, we need to see it before we believe it. Sometimes it's hard for us to trust it. And John talked about it. God's light came into the world, but for some reason, people chose darkness instead of the light. They loved the darkness more than they loved the light. So that's where your choice kind of comes into play. God had demonstrated his love for you by sending his son into the world, the light of the world. This love that we celebrate today, this love that really helps us and aids us in actually being joyful. When we talk about choosing joy, we're going to get there. In fact, we're going to get there next week. But if you don't have love, it is hard to be joyful. If you don't love, it's very hard to choose joy. If you don't have hope, it's hard to choose joy. If you don't have love, it's hard to choose joy. And for you to have love, you have to know that this is where it came from. God had an opportunity. He demonstrated something for us. He demonstrated that he was with us before we even decided if we were for him. And that decision comes down to this: do you love the light more than the darkness? Do you love the light more than the darkness? He was with us so that we could know that he was for us. And we needed that demonstration, and maybe you need that demonstration today. My prayer would be that God just reminds you of what he did for you, for the whole world, but specifically for you. That God so loved you that he gave you his son. He is with you, he is for you, and he demonstrated his love for you. Let me pray for you.